Hey everyone, and welcome back to another explainer. You know, as a historian, I spend the vast majority of my life buried in these completely forgotten, sometimes literally forbidden archives. I'm usually sifting through physical texts so incredibly old that the parchment practically turns to dust if you breathe on it too heavily. But every so often, you find something that just absolutely stops you dead in your tracks. Recently, I uncovered this chilling, highly fragmented manuscript. It's heavily inspired by the ancient Ars Goetia tradition, and it's known simply as Chapter 86, The Chains They Chose. Now, you might be expecting a story about massive wars, apocalyptic fire, or the clashing of legendary armies, right? Actually, scratch that. It doesn't detail any of those things. Instead, it's this gripping psychological thriller about the quiet, terrifying surrender of human agency. It maps out exactly how early humanity slowly, almost imperceptibly, traded the rigorous demands of their own self-reliance for the hollow, suffocating comfort of habit. So get ready, because the ancient shadows we're about to explore, they mirror the structure of our own modern society in ways that are honestly, genuinely unsettling. So let's dive right into this. We almost always assume humanity's independence was stolen by the sword, don't we? We picture these conquering warlords, oppressive tyrants, and violent subjugation. But these specific ancient records reveal a much more insidious truth about human nature. The loss of our independence wasn't a violent theft at all. It was a willing surrender. It was negotiated for the mere illusion of convenience. There's this incredible line: fear makes mortals run, but comfort teaches them to stay. Take a moment and really think about the profound psychological weight of that statement. The unseen forces detailed in these texts, they're described mostly as low-ranked spirits or shadowy entities. They realized a fundamental fatal flaw in the human mind. Humans will fight absolute terror with every single ounce of blood they have, but they will completely, willingly submit to a soft bed, a lucky omen, or an easy answer. Dependence grows deepest and strongest when it's simply allowed to name itself wisdom. During what the archives call the Age of Chosen Chains, this tragic, sweeping transition occurred across human behavior. Originally, survival relied entirely on practical wisdom and raw courage. It was a time when a farmer deeply studied the actual moisture of the soil, a healer memorized the incredibly bitter taste of medicinal herbs, and a leader used rigorous logical strategy. But as these unseen forces slowly began their work, a desperate reliance on unquestioned ritual took hold. What had first arrived as a fortunate whisper in the dark suddenly became an expected pattern. What had once felt like a sudden, miraculous rescue, it morphed into a strict, unyielding expectation. Humans were no longer taking bold, independent action. Instead, they were freezing in place, literally asking for permission from the shadows before they dared to take a single step forward. Now, what's really fascinating here is that the lowest-ranked entities in these texts lacked the sheer, catastrophic power of the high demon kings. They absolutely couldn't conquer with crowns or burn cities to ash. Instead, they employed a far more devastating, almost ironic tactic. They simply made men and women believe life was just a little bit easier when an unseen hand was nearby. They forged what the text calls an unknowing covenant. Think about it. A harvest saved by sheer luck one year became a harvest trusted entirely to the shadow the next year. A song praised by a mysterious voice once became a voice that felt it could no longer dare to sing alone. It's a terrifying psychological capture. It is the ultimate dark irony that humans gave up the very core of their agency just to save a little effort. They were wrapping themselves in chains of convenience and happily calling those chains blessings. Let's zoom in on the remote outer settlements to see how this actually played out.
Out there, humanity essentially became pawns on a colossal board that they had completely stopped trying to understand. And the change was so agonizingly gradual, it just felt like nature taking its course. The records say entire villages literally forgot their hands, outsourcing their survival entirely to the shadows. Hunters, people who once possessed the brilliant physical skill to track beasts through the harshest winters, they stopped stepping into the woods entirely unless a specific bird cried from a specific branch on the left side of an oak tree. Crazy, right? Mothers would place carved stones beneath beds to ward off fevers, telling themselves, oh, it's just a harmless precaution. But every single year, according to the text, the people worked a little less with their courage and a little more with their permission. These unseen forces never forced a single villager to kneel. They just made kneeling feel incredibly practical. And you might be thinking, well, sure, that's just superstitious folks out in the woods. But no, this dependency wasn't restricted to the outer settlements at all. It climbed the social ladder and infected the absolute highest echelons of society. Literally, no one, regardless of wealth or education, was immune to the comfort of the unseen omen. Elite merchants, they completely abandoned the rigorous mathematics of route planning and ledgers. Instead, if a trader earned silver after following a random dream route, they would obsessively follow it until they went completely bankrupt. Bankers started whispering strange names into the dark before counting their gold. And up in the royal courts, it's wild. Kings who claimed absolute divine authority were suddenly delaying entire wars and tearing up massive treaties just because a red candle guttered in a draft or a mirror cracked in the hallway. Even the most powerful crowns in the world had learned to bend entirely to invisible pressure. But honestly, perhaps the most tragic internal psychological struggle detailed in the archives occurred among the healers. These were individuals who spent a lifetime understanding the physical pulse, the unforgiving discipline of medicinal herbs, and the hard science of their era. The archives actually note that Bouger, an ancient entity who long understood healing as a strict, unforgiving physical discipline, grew utterly silent as he watched this unfold. Marbas, another figure of hidden knowledge, saw the danger immediately. They watched as the most highly educated humans of their time began to witness unexplainable recoveries. You know, like a fever breaking due to the strange timing of a whispered dream. The temptation to rely on that kind of magic, it was intoxicating. Slowly and painfully, the healers began to trust the shadow more than the pulse of the very patients lying right in front of them. There's a specific quote here that is absolutely crucial. Healing had become a door through which fear could enter, wearing mercy as a mask. I really want to linger on that for a second because it brilliantly illustrates why a miracle without understanding is so fundamentally dangerous. You see, the unseen entities didn't need every single patient to live. They only needed the survivors to tell the stories. Why? Because a survivor telling a story of impossible magic entirely removes the rigorous science of healing and replaces it with a desperate lottery of favor. A miracle remembered without understanding becomes a hook in the human mind, and a hook passed down through generations that becomes an unbreakable chain. When we accept the benefits of an invisible system without understanding the mechanics of how it actually works, we destroy our own independent judgment and kick the door wide open for absolute blind dependency. So, by the seventh turning of this historical conflict, these low-ranked, unseen forces discovered a mechanism far stronger than secrecy to protect their absolute power over humanity. I mean, think about it. How do you protect a massive lie? You don't hide it in the shadows. No, you bring it right out into the light and you turn it into a tradition. A secret can be exposed, right? It can be analyzed and eventually destroyed by a curious mind. But tradition, wow. Tradition is fiercely protected by affection, nostalgia, and immense community pressure.
Mortals do not defend every false practice because they believe it's scientifically true or logically sound. More often than not, they defend it to the death simply because their parents loved it first. Tradition became the ultimate impenetrable shield for an incredibly unhealthy dependency. Just look at the fierce, terrifying social enforcement that took hold as a result. The community itself became the blindfolded guards of their own psychological prison. If a stranger visiting a village pointed out the sheer madness of leaving perfectly good grain rotting in a barn for an unseen spirit, the mob immediately branded him arrogant. If a brilliant young physician held on to her medicinal herbs and questioned the old dream cures, fingers were pointed and she was violently dismissed as faithless. Clerics questioning market whispers were labeled unlucky. Because of this overwhelming peer pressure, these entities essentially became landlords of habit. They owned no fields, they possessed no courts, they inhabited no actual human bodies, yet human hands literally trembled with real, visceral fear when the invisible signs didn't arrive exactly on time. In the dark margins of these texts, we find the meticulous observations of a high-ranking entity, Vassago, the Prince of Hidden Things. While other demonic kings were out looking for grand, blood-soaked altars and massive temples to measure their conquest, Vassago was doing something much more subtle. He was essentially auditing human agency. He was counting the missing choices. He observed that true dependency rarely looks like fanatical, cultish worship. Actually, it much more often masquerades as reasonable caution, deep respect for one's elders, or practical everyday wisdom. He watched starving farmers refuse to plant under perfectly clear skies. He watched kings ignore incredibly wise counsel from their seasoned generals. Vassago realized that the exact moment fear successfully replaces independent judgment, the hidden hand has already won the war without lifting a single finger. And this leads us to the most gripping part of the archive. When every single survival instinct has been entirely outsourced, when humanity has traded every ounce of its agency for a whisper in the dark, what happens? Like, what actually happens when an entire village completely forgets its own hands? As we dig deeper into these texts, the pacing shifts dramatically. The historical record provides one chilling, suspenseful anomaly. It's a moment that violently challenged this entire invisible, deeply entrenched system of human conformity. It was the absolute turning point of the age, and it proved that the system, for all its immense invisible weight, had a fatal flaw. The very first refusal didn't come from a mighty king wielding a sword. It didn't come from a wealthy merchant with a private army or a brilliant scholar armed with philosophy. No way! It came from a tired, impoverished woman in a struggling, isolated outer village. Her family had waited 3 full, agonizing days for the old, unseen sign before they were allowed to plant their crops. The sky above was perfectly clear. The dark soil beneath their feet was rich and entirely ready. Yet the entire village stood frozen in the dirt, absolutely paralyzed by the eerie silence, waiting for a cry from a bird that simply had not returned. The text paints this visceral, almost claustrophobic picture of the suffocating tension in that village. It's this clash between the very real, gnawing physical pain of a starving family and the terrifying, phantom weight of generations of deeply ingrained superstition. We can only imagine her internal psychological struggle, right? But the archives are crystal clear on what she did next. Her hands must have been shaking. Her neighbors were literally screaming at her, promising divine retribution and swearing she would bring a horrific curse upon them all. But she ignored the perfectly clear sky. She ignored the frantic warnings of the village elders. She ignored the absolute lack of a whispered dream. She simply grabbed her bag of seeds, walked out into the dirt alone, and acted. She planted without a single shred of permission from the invisible world.
She used her own two hands and her own independent judgment to break the ancient pattern. It was a singular, monumental act of defiance against the invisible chains of habit. And the result? Boom. With that single act, the illusion shattered like glass. It was like a dark crow fragmenting into 1,000 pieces in the open sky. By sunset, the rest of the village had actually followed her lead right into the fields. Now, the text explicitly notes that they didn't follow her out of sudden enlightenment, and they certainly didn't do it out of newfound bravery. They followed her simply because, in the end, hunger was stronger than superstition. Practical necessity and the undeniable raw reality of physical starvation finally eclipsed their blind reliance on whispered rituals. The paralyzing spell of the omen was broken entirely by the courageous action of one individual who just refused to spend another second waiting for an invisible signal. This isolated act of independent judgment broke the unseen chain in just one muddy field. But let me tell you, in the hidden courts of these invisible forces, one field was more than enough to send absolute shockwaves of alarm. The texts tell us that Bael looked upon the reports of this planted field with cold, calculating fury. Paimon began frantically collecting the strange, chaotic new songs of human refusal. Andromalius panicked at the breaking of their unseen, perfect law. But Valac simply smiled into the dark. He realized that the true war of crowns was no longer about grand cosmic battles. The battlefield had officially shifted from the heavens directly to the human heart itself. They learned right then and there that human dependence is incredibly powerful, but it's inherently fragile. It literally must be actively renewed every single day by fear.
So as we close this explainer, we kind of have to turn the lens away from the ancient archives and look directly in the mirror. Because this isn't just a story about ancient peasants, forgotten barns, and superstitious birds. We have to ask ourselves, what are the invisible omens we are waiting for today? How often do we surrender our own independent judgment to the comforting, unseen algorithms, the intense social conformities, or the endless scrolling metrics of our modern world before we dare to take action? Are we acting with our own hands, stepping into our own fields? Or are we too just standing frozen, waiting for the modern equivalent of a bird to cry? Think about that the next time you feel the overwhelming urge to seek permission from the crowd. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating text with me, and I'll see you in the next explainer.